So, good morning. My name is Brian Grimm with the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation. Wonderful to welcome you here. We'll have a panel of three people, so we'll have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. The order of presentation, I'll be going first, and then Richard Fulton will be going second, and Alicio Cristovam will be going third. So, we'll begin uh, right now. So, I'm going to begin by giving you a preview of something that's happening this afternoon at 2 o'clock in this same room. We're launching the Faith at Work Network for Latin America. We'll be having several companies, SAP, Salesforce, and Dell Technologies, people of faith from those companies starting to network. Oh, we might have to start over again. Were we okay already? Okay. Great. So our Zoom is working. So greeting those watching on Zoom. So this afternoon at 2 o'clock in the same room, we'll be launching the Faith at Work Network across Latin America. And I thought in my introduction to give you an idea of the potential for bringing faith into the workplace is to introduce you to several of the companies that are doing this. So first, I have several videos that I'll share. The first gives you a broad overview of what's happening in some of the world's biggest and best corporations.
Some of the world's most successful companies are creating faith-friendly workplaces that welcome all employees' religious beliefs. Why are they doing it? Because an environment where people are free to bring their whole selves to work attracts and keeps the best talent. And that's just good business. The annual Corporate Religious Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Index tracks how more and more companies have created such workplaces, like Google's Interbelief Network, Salesforce with its FaithForce Equality Group, and Dell's Interfaith Employee Resource Group.
I started IBN so that everyone, no matter what their belief system, could have a voice at Google, an official one, a united one. Before we existed, religious communities really didn't have that. Things I think that Googlers took for granted, we didn't have access to. We couldn't celebrate events that had meaning to us.
The recent national survey, What American Workers Really Think About Religion, found that 36% of American workers, or 50 million people, have experienced or witnessed religious discrimination in the workplace. That is not only an attack on human dignity and a violation of foundational rights, it also represents a tremendous loss in productivity and motivation in the workplace. Education is the key to ending religious discrimination. Follow the lead of companies getting it right and start the conversation. Experts at the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation are ready to help.
So one of the measures mentioned in that video is the READY Index, the Corporate Religious Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Index, which companies are voluntarily disclosing how much they're including religion as part of diversity, or how much they're making their workplaces religiously inclusive. So these are the list of companies that are participating, and it's growing year by year. This every year in Washington, D.C., we have an annual celebration to recognize these companies, giving voice and visibility to this faith at work movement happening across the world, as I'll also show. So in London this year, for the first time, we also did a similar measurement of religious inclusion, faith-friendly workplaces among the FTSE 100 companies. And some companies that you may have heard of, such as Rolls-Royce, HSBC, are scoring highly in terms of making their workplaces places where you can bring your faith to work and not have to leave it outside the door when you come to work. And this movement in the UK also has gotten the attention of 10 Downing Street, where we were able to meet at 10 Downing Street and start really what is now a movement, the same movement we're seeing in the US also happening in the UK as well. This movement is also spreading to India and Asia. So every year, well, this will be the second year, we have an annual conference in India that is working on the same things of including religion, faith, and belief, even including atheism as a belief system as part of corporate diversity initiatives. So, as I mentioned, at 2 o'clock this afternoon, we'll be launching the first Latin America Faith at Work network across all of Latin America. We have speakers from 3 companies, and I thought what I'd do in the rest of my presentation is give you a little idea of what's going on inside of each of these companies. The first company that we'll look at is SAP, Global Data AI infrastructure company, and their group is called Interfaith Alliance. So we have a video, we have to link to it outside. We'll bring that in.
Bring your authentic self to work at SAP. Celebrate SAP's commitment to diversity and inclusion. But where does faith fit in? Can religious practice, spiritual belief, and tradition be part of that picture? That's the inspiration behind SAP Interfaith Alliance. SAP Interfaith Alliance is an SAP employee network group, part of SAP's Global Diversity and Inclusion Program. Our mission is to give all employees a safe and open forum to come together for learning and understanding of every faith, to empower all of us to bring our complete self to work without prejudices. SAP Interfaith Alliance is for people of all faiths. It's also for people who don't have a faith. We welcome clumsy conversations. We encourage not mere tolerance, but acceptance. Not just accommodation, but integration. We focus on individual beliefs, but shared values. We explore our differences, and we discover our similarities. Formed in 2021, SAP Interfaith Alliance has more than 200 members representing 12 faiths, plus people with no specific faith. We're excited by our progress, as SAP is now a top faith-friendly company in the Religious Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Index. Now we're eager to grow with plans for new programs, events, and partnerships. Ready to get involved? Want to share your story? We want to hear from you. SAP Interfaith Alliance is open to people both inside and outside of SAP. Reach out to SAP Interfaith Alliance now. Email us at sap_interfaith_alliance@global.corp.sap. Understand different beliefs and embrace shared values by being a part of SAP Interfaith Alliance.
So very interesting that they gave you an email address. So these companies are not only working on making their workplaces inclusive for people of faith, but they're willing to engage with the communities around them. And just 3 weeks ago, I was in New York City at Citibank, who's launching a very similar initiative to SAP. And the vice president for diversity from SAP was part of our panel helping Citibank launch the same initiative. So on our READY index, the Corporate Religious Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Index, one of the questions is, do companies do they share what they're doing with other companies? So one company can spread this same culture to other companies as well as to society in general. And Dell Technologies, who will be also speaking this afternoon, has done that. At our annual event this year in Washington, they produced a short video to share about how they're communicating with other companies on this topic about spreading the message that every company should be religiously inclusive. And then also not just religiously inclusive, but active in their communities to help in ways that faith can help in their own communities. So here's a short video from Dell Technologies sharing what they do to spread this word among other companies.
At Dell, we're committed to assisting organizations in launching faith-based employee resource groups to foster diverse and inclusive workplaces. We actively support these initiatives, ensuring they thrive within corporate cultures worldwide. Dell's interfaith leadership engages directly with companies, sharing resources and processes, and co-facilitating best practices with diversity conferences. We offer guidance on establishing global ERGs, focusing on structure, process, and documentation, while collaborating across various levels, global, regional, and faith-specific. This includes co-facilitating sessions at diversity conferences, where we share the valuable practices we've developed through our experience. Moreover, we assist companies with existing ERGs to expand into regional or country-specific by sharing our best practices and structured approach. On behalf of Dell, thank you for your engagement and commitment to creating inclusive workplaces.
So the one person mentioned from Latin America, Andrew Mello, will be the person helping to present this afternoon. Salesforce, if you're not familiar with that company, they produce software to help manage customer relationships. So they're the largest CSM provider in the world, and they have branches all over the world. One thing that Salesforce has done is they've helped to spread this not just company to company, but around the world. They help us sponsor a major conference in London earlier this year in March, and they are one of the key sponsors of our work in India. So I'll give you just a glimpse. Of course, each country and culture has a different feel. I'll show you a little bit about the work in India.
The Dare to Overcome conference is a good start in India right now.
We're delighted to host the first Dare to Overcome in India.
We're committed to having Dare to Overcome here as its global headquarters for the years to come because India is rising, it's got energy, and the world is looking to India for leadership.
Increasingly polarizing times, dissent being trampled upon, differences being not celebrated but vilified. In those times, Dare to Overcome is a powerful mantra.
In India, we normally accept all religions. We learn to live with different religions, but we should also introduce it into business.
Diversity and inclusion should not just be a buzzword.
So for me, as a transgender person at the workplace, it means that I can carry all my labels to work today.
Dare to Overcome will be a movement, because there is no problem in the world that doesn't have a solution, but you need the courage and dare to do it.
We're all human beings. We have incredible potential, and we can be whatever it is we want to do as long as we dare to overcome and dare to dream.
So you're all invited to India in December 8th and 9th. Welcome to come and learn about this movement. So that I tried to give just a little bit of taste of the different ways this is manifesting itself in different companies, different corporations. We use the mantra, the title "Dare to Overcome," to brand our conferences. We're overcoming those differences that divide us, because as many of the speakers say, we have more in common than we have different things in difference. So with that, I'll finish my portion. And next, Richard Fulton, a very distinguished religious liberty scholar. We've worked together through the years, and Richard, and he's familiar with the work that's been going on. So appreciate your follow-up comments.
Brian, thank you. A privilege to be on the panel with you and with Judge Christovam. I'd say, as you look at the program, it's interesting. It's listed as there being two moderators, which are Brian and the judge, and myself as a discussion starter. So it struck me I must need a lot of moderation to have two moderators. And if you know the show Cabaret, I'm mindful of a particular song when I say two moderators and just one discussion starter. But in any event, I'm really pleased to be here. And the themes that you've just heard Brian discuss and we're going to discuss here really are very much related to what we just heard in the plenary about issues of pluralism and inclusion and the need to develop structures, both in terms of education and elsewhere, that recognize and promote differences and allow people to come together, notwithstanding those differences. So Brian's work with the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation is aimed at actualizing an important principle arising out of that need to respect difference, that workers should be able to bring their whole selves to the workplace, and they should no more be expected to leave their religious identities at the door, an essential aspect of who they are, than their race or ethnicity. In the age of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, respecting and promoting diversity and inclusion regarding religion seems an imperative corollary. So I want to say, just as BFRP's work is focused on helping businesses to make their workplaces a welcoming space for people of all faiths and of none, inevitably there are legal questions that are associated with these efforts. Among those legal questions are, what happens when you have a business that, unlike the businesses that Brian is dealing with, are not so interested in making their workplace into a welcoming place? What do you do in terms of what the legal obligations, at least, of those employers are to provide a reasonable accommodation of the religious practices of their employees? And sometimes it strikes me that even some of these businesses may have goodwill and good faith, but when a particular practice needs to be accommodated, they may feel that they can't make that accommodation. And then the question is, what's the standard? What do you do to make the business provide the accommodation? There's two other questions. I don't know that I'll have time to go into all of them, but another question is, can a business go too far in providing an accommodation to the point that the creation of a safe space for one employee creates an unsafe space for another employee? How do you deal with those situations? And finally, is it legitimate for an employer to promote its own religious perspective in a secular workplace? And I'm putting aside there the question of religious institutions, which raises a whole set of additional complexities. So I'm an American lawyer, so I'm going to focus on the US scene. I recognize that each country is different and will bring problems and solutions to the table that grow from their own experiences and legal regimes. It's nevertheless useful to consider the US approach, both the good and the bad, and the efforts to address those problems. Notably, while there is debate how far to take the principle of accommodation, the premise of American civil rights law, is that at times provision should be made to provide for a differential treatment of religious practice, as opposed to the European practice, which is reluctant to do so. And that's represented as epitome by the French principle of laïcité, which tries to keep public spaces in many times free of any religious presence whatsoever. On the other hand, I'm told, and perhaps the judge is going to talk about this, Brazil has laws that are very protective of religious practice and against religious discrimination. So first, why religious accommodation? For many religiously observant Americans, the greatest peril to their ability to carry out their religious faiths on a day-to-day basis may come in the workplace. Of course, many employers recognize that both they and their employees benefit when they mutually work together to find a fit between the needs of the workplace and the religious obligations of the employee, but it is not always so. In too many cases, employees who want to do a good job are faced with employers who do not want to make a reasonable accommodation for observance of the Sabbath and other holy days, or for prayer time. There are employees who must wear religiously required garb, such as a yarmulke, a turban, or clothing that meets modesty requirements. There are employers who are required by their faith to be groomed in a certain way, such as not shaving their beard. And there are also, in addition to these issues of holy day observance and religious garb and grooming, while they account for the lion's share of religious accommodation cases, they do not exhaust the situations in which an employee is faced with the choice of following their faith or earning a livelihood. Employees may also seek accommodation because work duties run afoul of religious beliefs and practices. In recent years, there have also been a slew of cases in which employees have sought exemption from workplace rules that require them to be vaccinated against COVID. And there's at least one instance in which an employee was penalized for taking protective measures against the disease because the employer was opposed to such practices. So there are a number of societal factors that have underlie the rise in the number of employees seeking religious accommodation over recent decades. Although I'm happy to say that given the kind of work that Brian is doing and many others, that the problems with seeking that religious accommodation are declining over time. So these include the movement toward a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week economy with consequent conflicts between the needs of the workplace and religious demands for rest and worship on Saturdays, Sundays, or holidays. In the United States, it's the increasing diversity associated with immigration, as well as diverging lifestyles and that are marked by a broad spectrum of religious traditions, some of which may clash with workplace parameters that do not take into account the religious observances of minority religious communities. Often, for instance, there are dress codes that the employer will say are business necessity, but they really sort of fall in the category of just so, thinking of the Rudyard Kipling stories. They just so that the employer thinks people have to be dressed in a certain way for the workplace to look appropriate. There's also latent and sometimes not so latent animosity toward some religious traditions, such as the severe spike in religious discrimination claims directly after the September 11 attacks, when Sikh and Muslim Americans faced greater hostility at work, not to mention the growth in hate crimes based in religious animus that's been taking place over time. And finally, there's a growing emphasis on material values at the expense of spiritual ones, with some employers refusing to see the need for any adjustment in workplace requirements to allow for religious practices. So U.S. federal law, which was enacted in 1972 as an amendment to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, defines as a form of religious discrimination the failure of an employer of 15 or more people provide a reasonable accommodation of an employee's religious practice or belief, unless to do so would impose an undue burden on the employer. Now, this sounds like a reasonable standard on its face: reasonable accommodation, undue hardship. Unfortunately, it was read by the courts in the United States for many years based on their understanding of a 1977 Supreme Court decision in a narrow fashion that for years failed to assure accommodations in cases where they arguably should have been accorded. While there have been issues associated with the question of what exactly is a reasonable accommodation, it was in the court's narrower interpretation of undue hardship that religiously observant employees most often came to grief. For many years, undue hardship was interpreted to mean anything more than a de minimis difficulty or expense. As some of you may recall from high school Latin, de minimis means ain't much. So for many years, as part of my work as a legislative advocate at the American Jewish Committee, and I was pleased to see the shout out to AJC in Brian's materials, I served as co-chair of the Coalition for Workplace Religious Freedom, a coalition that was dedicating to have Congress enact legislation that would enhance protections under U.S. civil rights law for an employee who requests accommodation of their religious practice in the workplace, in part by redefining the meaning of undue hardship. I worked on these questions for many years, as I said, through the Coalition for Workplace Religious Freedom, but we never were successful in getting the law to be amended to change the standard on undue hardship. While our coalition drew on a wide range of faith groups and was originally supported by advocacy groups on both the right and the left, over time, many civil rights advocates came to oppose a more robust religious accommodation regime, not because of accommodation of holy days, dress, or grooming, which they generally supported, but because of the concern that accommodation of objections to certain duties will lead to negative impact on third parties, such as customers and fellow employees. So what were they concerned about? They were concerned about a healthcare worker who refused to be involved in providing an abortion, even in emergency situations where a woman's health or very life was in danger. Pharmacies that refused to dispense, or pharmacists who refused to dispense drugs on religious basis, or the danger, as they saw it, of proselytizing in the workplace, which would pit groups one against the other. So while we never succeeded in getting that legislation enacted, just last year, the Supreme Court handed down a decision in which, while the implications are still being worked out in the lower courts, an important change took place in the protections afforded religiously observant employees. The court clarified, and I'll put that in air quotes because everybody thinks they understood what the court did back in 1977, but the court now, many years later, was saying, no, we didn't really mean undue hardship only means de minimis difficulty or expense. Instead, the court said, what we should read undue hardship as meaning is anything more for an employer, that employer must accommodate religious practice or belief unless doing so would impose a substantial burden. That is, the employer is required to show that the burden of granting an accommodation would result in substantial increased costs in relation to the conduct of its particular business. It's on its face a more protective standard for employees. Even before that case, the EEOC took the position that an employer should, as a matter of good practice, engage in an interactive process with an employee when they make a request for accommodation. One difference that's been made by Groff now is that employees, or more likely the lawyers, now can come into that process better armed to argue for a particular accommodation, lest the employer face a stronger case for accommodation and a loss in court or before a civil rights enforcement agency. So that's sort of where we are in terms of the law of accommodation as it now stands. I just want to briefly make some other points. And that relates again to the two other questions that I raised. Can a business go too far in providing accommodation? And is it legitimate for the employer to promote its own religious perspective in the secular workplace? Employers are not required to remove religion in the workplace, and attempts to do so can result in religious accommodation claims for employees. Similarly, an employer is not obligated to strip its workplace of all indications of its own religious orientation, but must be careful, and here the lines are not always so clear, that it does not do so to an extent that employees of no or different faiths are pressured into unwelcome activities. The issue of proselytizing in the workplace. Can an employee claim a right to proselytize as a religious accommodation to its religious obligation to do so? Well, here I would draw a comparison to the law involving sexual harassment, which is where a fellow employee insistently and continually keeps asking for a date with a fellow employee who's not interested. At some point, this amounts to sexual harassment. And it's pretty clear as well that preaching the gospel to a fellow employee who has said they are not interested at some point becomes religious harassment, which the employer is obligated to stop. Some forms of proselytization may be so severe and disruptive that even in one instance, such as telling a fellow employee that they're going to hell because they are of the wrong faith or because of their sexual orientation, may be enough to constitute per se harassment and grounds for some kind of disciplinary action to be taken. As to an employer seeking to use its position to push a particular religious perspective, let's look at a recent case in which the EEOC, the federal enforcement agency, sued an employer on behalf of a Buddhist employee who claimed that she and other employees were retaliated against and eventually terminated because they refused to participate in pre-work Bible studies. Even companies run according to the owner's religious principles. I'm talking here about private secular companies, but the owner may have religious principles that they're trying to institute in the operation of business, cannot require adherence to religious beliefs or practices as a term and condition of employment. Similarly, there are no legal prohibitions on employers allowing employees to conduct Bible study on their work premises during breaks or outside of working time, not to mention organizing in ERGs around faith groups for mutual support and study, but such activities may not be mandatory, and employees who decline to participate in such activities must not face any negative employment consequences. Similarly, an employer taking action against an employee because of the employee's religious beliefs can be problematic. And here again, I want to refer back to that case I mentioned earlier, in which an employee was fired because he was taking preventive measures against COVID, and the employer was compelled to pay a substantial monetary judgment because the basis for the employer's demand was the employee's religious beliefs that one ought not to be taking preventive measures against COVID. A couple of other observations. Even before Groff, it seemed pretty clear that an employer faced a high bar when it declined to provide an accommodation for, when it had provided an accommodation for many years and suddenly stopped providing that accommodation, deciding that maybe it was a new manager, maybe they suddenly decided it was too difficult, and then the courts asked the obvious question, how come it wasn't an undue hardship all of these years, and now you can't do it anymore? And those cases have become more common in the wake, and those results have become more common in the wake of the Groff decision, which strengthened protection of religious observance. So I also could talk about, but maybe we'll save for questions, responses to these problems of failure to accommodate. But I want to stop now and give the judge time to speak. Thank you, everyone.
Bom dia, good morning. I am going to speak in Portuguese because my English is very bad. Eu sou juiz do trabalho na Bahia, titular da primeira vara do trabalho de Simões Filho, e eu me aproximo desses casos que foram narrados pelos professores Fulton e Green, com as lentes de um juiz que tem que dar solução aos casos concretos que surgem e que envolvem a presença da fé no ambiente de trabalho. De início, eu quero expressar a minha gratidão aos professores Rodrigo Vitorino e Cole Durham pelo convite para participar dessa sessão. Eu me sinto muito honrado por compartilhar esse momento especial com duas personalidades lendárias, né, na promoção global da liberdade religiosa, os renomados pesquisadores Dr. Green e Dr. Fulton, dos quais eu sou um profundo admirador, porque eles têm uma trajetória na luta pela paz e pelo desenvolvimento sustentável de nosso planeta impecável. O tema específico de nossa sessão guarda íntima conexão com o tema central do Fórum Interreligioso do G20 e do Fórum Anual sobre Religião e Desenvolvimento Sustentável. De fato, não é possível falar no bem-estar da população planetária sem tratar do bem-estar do trabalhador no ambiente de trabalho. Até mesmo porque é no ambiente de trabalho que os seres humanos passam a maior parte do tempo de suas vidas. Por outro lado, qualquer abordagem sobre o bem-estar do trabalhador que não passe pelo tema da espiritualidade é empobrecedora. O desenvolvimento da espiritualidade tem um enorme potencial para elevar o bem-estar do trabalhador, contribuindo para a preservação da sua saúde, tanto psíquica quanto física, já que sabemos que as doenças emocionais, como a depressão e os transtornos de ansiedade, costumam também afetar o corpo. A promoção do trabalho decente constitui o maior objetivo da Organização Internacional do Trabalho, que foi fundada durante a assinatura do Tratado de Versalhes. No meu sentir, um trabalho, melhor dizendo, somente pode ser considerado decente quando o ambiente de trabalho é saudável, ou seja, apto a preservar e promover tanto a saúde física quanto a saúde emocional do trabalhador. Embora haja quem, a exemplo do ativista ateísta Sam Harris, fale em espiritualidade sem Deus, o que para mim é bastante controverso, a espiritualidade no ambiente do trabalho está, como regra, associada às crenças religiosas. Daí porque, neste campo, falar de espiritualidade é também falar de liberdade religiosa. Neste ponto, eu peço permissão para citar o neuropsiquiatra judeu-austríaco Viktor Frankl, fundador da terceira escola vienense de psicoterapia, a logoterapia, sobrevivente do Holocausto, autor do best-seller Em Busca do Sentido, um psiquiatra no campo de concentração. Para ele, a motivação fundamental do ser humano é buscar o sentido da vida, algo que eu particularmente identifico com aquele senso de eternidade que, nas palavras do sábio Salomão, foi colocado no coração do homem por Deus, como está descrito nas Sagradas Escrituras, em Eclesiastes, capítulo 3, versículo 11. As pessoas podem buscar o seu sentido existencial em algumas realizações, como a obtenção de poder, de riqueza, de conhecimento, ou até a defesa de uma causa política ou ideológica. Mas a fé religiosa transcende a todas essas realizações porque confere um sentido que, além de explicar o mundo à nossa volta, lida com questões que sempre intrigaram a humanidade, a exemplo do enfrentamento da dor e da vida após a morte. Essa vontade de que a vida faça sentido, parece-me, é uma das principais razões para a persistência do fenômeno religioso, cujo fim, temerariamente, vaticinado por iluministas não tão iluminados assim, jamais ocorreu. Ao contrário, a religião até tem voltado com muita força à arena pública. God is back, como afirmaram com muita perspicácia os editores da Economist, John Bickleford e Adrian Wooldridge, em uma das suas obras conjuntas. O fenômeno religioso é persistente, duradouro, e por conta disso, a liberdade religiosa continua sendo um dos direitos humanos mais relevantes. Não é à toa que está consagrada nos mais importantes instrumentos jurídicos internacionais de direitos humanos. Historicamente, aliás, a liberdade religiosa foi o primeiro dos direitos humanos a ser reconhecido, tendo sido sua consagração uma consequência direta das guerras religiosas que se seguiram à Reforma Protestante. nas palavras do jurista alemão Georg Jelinek, talvez o maior constitucionalista da Alemanha de todos os tempos, a liberdade religiosa é historicamente a verdadeira mãe das demais liberdades. Pois bem, há sem dúvida muitas razões pelas quais trabalhadores são deixados para trás no mercado de trabalho. Estou certo, porém, que a discriminação religiosa é uma das mais hediondas, tornando-se ainda mais grave nos casos em que a identidade religiosa do trabalhador se confunde com a sua identidade étnica, como, por exemplo, no caso dos Sikhs do Punjab. Não conheço outra forma para combater a discriminação religiosa no ambiente de trabalho, senão a proteção, a defesa e a promoção da liberdade religiosa do trabalhador. É certo que há situações em que a satisfação das necessidades religiosas legítimas do trabalhador pode colidir com interesses empresariais legítimos. Nem sempre a demanda religiosa do trabalhador poderá ser satisfeita, e é sempre desafiador encontrar a maneira adequada para que as crenças e práticas religiosas sejam recepcionadas no espaço empresarial de um modo que, ao mesmo tempo, contribuam para a construção de um ambiente de trabalho decente e não destruam a legítima aspiração do empregador à obtenção de maiores níveis de eficiência e produtividade. Isso se resolve nos Estados Unidos, como já ouvimos, com o chamado dever de acomodação razoável, que consta do título 7º da Lei de Direitos Civis, pelo qual o empregador está obrigado a atender às demandas religiosas do trabalhador, desde que isso não lhe imponha uma dificuldade indevida. Não temos no Brasil uma regra legal específica que atribua tal dever ao empregador, mas tenho defendido desde 2012, com algum sucesso, que o dever de acomodação razoável pode ser extraído diretamente do texto constitucional, a partir da combinação do princípio da proteção do trabalhador, do princípio da função social da empresa, dos direitos fundamentais à liberdade religiosa e à liberdade de expressão, e também do modelo de laicidade adotado pelo ordenamento jurídico constitucional brasileiro. Mais do que isso, tenho considerado que o dever de acomodação razoável é inerente a todo Estado que se proponha a ser um Estado social e democrático de direito, como o brasileiro. No ano passado, a tese da acomodação razoável foi acolhida por uma decisão do Tribunal Regional do Trabalho da 2ª Região, que condenou uma empresa a indenizar por danos morais uma empregada que possui uma religião de matriz africana, que foi proibida pelo empregador de utilizar os seus colares religiosos. Algumas decisões de juízes de primeira instância, eu sou de primeira instância, né, já haviam reconhecido anteriormente a possibilidade da aplicação do dever de acomodação razoável, mas essa foi a primeira decisão de uma corte regional, de um tribunal de 2ª instância. Eu quero dizer que eu tenho defendido isso até na Espanha. Eu tenho um livro escrito com um professor espanhol e nós defendemos esse posicionamento na Espanha. E o livro tem sido bem recebido. Assim, fico muito feliz ao perceber que muitas empresas estão levando a sério as crenças e práticas religiosas de seus empregados na sua busca por maior eficiência e produtividade nos negócios. Meu desejo é o de que todas as empresas possam descobrir que a liberdade religiosa é proveitosa para estimular o diálogo, a inovação e para contribuir com o senso de pertencimento dos trabalhadores, o que, é claro, depende da construção de um ambiente de confiança entre os trabalhadores e seu empregador. Este novo comportamento, muito bem mostrado pelo Dr. Green, vai ao encontro da humanização do trabalho, isto é, daquilo que a OIT, a Organização Internacional do Trabalho, denomina de trabalho decente, e me parece uma importante e rara convergência entre o capital e o trabalho. Pouco importa que a mudança de paradigma tenha motivação econômica. Pouco importa. É altamente positivo que o trabalhador tenha a sua identidade religiosa respeitada no ambiente de trabalho. É assim que se constrói um trabalho decente. Podemos com certeza afirmar que nós não precisamos de menos liberdade religiosa no mundo do trabalho. Definitivamente, nós precisamos de mais liberdade religiosa. A ideia de supressão da expressão religiosa do ambiente de trabalho é antidemocrática e pode conduzir ao adoecimento emocional do trabalhador religioso. E no caso dos grupos étnico-religiosos, pode lançar na miséria contingentes inteiros de imigrantes, com graves consequências danosas para a paz social. A liberdade religiosa é, essencialmente, a liberdade de expressar as ideias religiosas por meio do discurso e das ações. Desta forma, eu entendo que a sua limitação no ambiente de trabalho somente se justifica quando efetivamente prejudicar a eficiência dos negócios e a harmonia do ambiente de trabalho. Mas não se combate isso com a supressão da liberdade religiosa, como pensam, os adeptos do modelo francês. Eu creio que isso é combatido com o diálogo, que busque promover uma cultura de respeito e de tolerância. Eu penso que até mesmo o proselitismo religioso pode ser acomodado no ambiente de trabalho, bastando para isso que não cause prejuízo à condução dos negócios e que respeite a recusa de quem não quiser ouvir o discurso proselitista. O empregador, no meu sentir, não pode ter a prerrogativa de suprimir a expressão religiosa no ambiente de trabalho e transformá-lo numa zona livre de religião. Se este direito for reconhecido ao empregador, ele estará autorizado a pôr uma mordaça no trabalhador e impedi-lo que manifeste o seu pensamento sobre qualquer assunto, o que vai violar também a liberdade de expressão. Por fim, anoto que, para qualquer ordem jurídica fundada na dignidade da pessoa humana, é repugnante a ideia de que o trabalhador seja colocado, sem qualquer razão legítima, numa situação de ter de escolher entre sacrificar a própria identidade religiosa e o seu meio de subsistência. Não podemos perder de vista que a remuneração percebida pelo empregado não legitima por si só um controle absoluto do empregador sobre ele. Como está escrito na Constituição da OIT e também foi reiterado na Declaração de Filadélfia, o trabalho não é uma mera mercadoria. E eu digo mais, o trabalhador não é uma mera engrenagem. E o trabalho não é apenas meio de subsistência, mas também é fonte de identidade e de realização pessoal. O trabalhador é, antes de tudo, um cidadão, um titular de direitos humanos que deve ter a sua dignidade respeitada em qualquer ambiente, e em especial no ambiente onde busca o sustento próprio e familiar e a sua realização pessoal. Ele não deixa a sua identidade quando troca o seu uniforme no vestiário ao entrar na empresa. Ele é um ser humano que tem dignidade e que é titular, antes de tudo, de todos os direitos humanos. Muito obrigado e eu estou à disposição de todos.
Thank you. So we have some time for questions. Yes, please.
I am Thiago Vieira from Porto Alegre, south of Brazil. Thank you very much for your presentations. I have a short question for Professor Aloysio Cristóvão, so I will do in português. Professor, na Suprema Corte dos Estados Unidos, recentemente, no caso United States versus Kennedy, um professor, ele tinha o costume de orar no meio do campo, ele era professor de educação física, e depois da partida de futebol americano, independente do resultado da partida, quando terminava, ele orava no meio do campo 30 segundos, 1 minuto. Em razão disso, ele foi demitido por uma violação à laicidade. Esse professor era um funcionário público. E a Suprema Corte, então, reverteu essa situação no caso United States versus Kennedy, dizendo que não, abandonando o Lemon Test e dizendo que não seria uma violação à liberdade religiosa. A pergunta: no Brasil, um professor que tem a mesma atitude, tanto no ambiente público, mas especialmente no ambiente privado, que aí seria um caso que chegaria a Vossa Excelência, no ambiente privado, no Brasil, um professor pode orar no meio do campo antes ou depois do jogo? So, other professors, if you want to respond, also I appreciate it too. Thank you.
Tiago, a parte que diz respeito à Suprema Corte Americana, eu acho que quem está mais habilitado a responder e a falar, naturalmente, é o professor, é o doutor Poten, né, que é advogado. Mas aqui no Brasil eu não vislumbro nenhuma dificuldade. É claro que eu estou falando agora sobre o empregador privado. Eu sei que aqui há muitos americanos, há muitos estrangeiros, mas a Justiça do Trabalho, pelo menos no Brasil, ela só trata das relações de trabalho no âmbito privado. Essa relação com o Estado a gente não trata. Então, no âmbito privado, eu não vejo qualquer dificuldade. Claro que a gente tem que observar algumas peculiaridades. Por exemplo, o empregador é uma organização religiosa? É uma escola confessional? É uma escola muçulmana? É uma escola judaica? Quer dizer, há muitas questões que devem ser observadas e a gente só vai poder perceber isso no caso concreto. Mas, assim, pelo menos prima facie, assim, superficialmente, não há nenhum problema de acomodação nessa situação. O professor Fulton quer falar?
So, sure, thank you. Okay, I'm being promoted to professor and doctor here, which I appreciate. But a Juris Doctor, I suppose that's close enough. So let me say about the Kennedy case. Oh, and I'm hearing my own voice here. Let me say about the Kennedy case that from the perspective of people committed to separation of church and state in the United States, it seemed to go through all the red lights that have been set up by the Supreme Court for many years. And in fact, the court itself in that case said, we're eliminating the test that many of us had understood previously to be how you determine whether or not the government has crossed the line, is engaging in prohibited religious activity. Having said that, and having said that the court did these things, it then interpreted the facts of the case in a way that was pretty astonishing. And much of the dissent by Justice, I believe it was Justice Ginsburg, but I don't recall at this point, but much of the dissent by one of the justices went through the facts of the case to show that, in fact, they were not as bland as portrayed by the majority of the court, and that even under the standards established by that majority of the court, the new standards, that it had gone beyond what was permitted on those standards. So what am I talking about? There was a question of whether or not this was a public activity, that is to say, and we're talking about a state university, of course, because the First Amendment issues don't apply to private universities. But was this an event that was taking place as part of a public event of the university, or was the coach praying in private, which of course would be nobody's business? And there he was on that field praying for all the public to see. Very hard to understand how that could be private prayer. And that relates to another issue. Was he still on duty, or was this after his duties as a coach had ended? And there also, there seems to be a mismatch between the way the majority of the court portrayed the facts and the way the dissent portrayed them. And finally, was there coercion? This may be the most important issue of all. Was the coercion of the football players to participate in the prayer? When you look at the pictures, you see they're all congregated around the coach. And is this some kind of implicit coercion of those football players to participate with the coach versus something that a few of them might, after hours and in private, voluntarily go to do with him? And it really resonates with what we were talking about before about the workplace. How careful you have to be not to do things that are explicitly or implicitly coercing workers, or in this case, students, to participate in prayer that they don't want to do. So I'm not sure this is responsive to your question, but I think it shows that we have, in the United States, while the protections of free exercise have been enhanced in some ways, mainly that Groff against the Joy case I talked about and the impact on the civil rights laws, in other ways, some of the protections that were in place for religious liberty are not as strong as they once were, because the ability of schools, public universities in this case, to be engaged in seeming to promote a particular religion, some of those barriers to doing that now seem to have been struck down. Thank you.
Yeah, next question.
Thank you very much for tackling a very challenging, difficult topic, because we really have three variables. My name is Fred Kruger from San Francisco. I'm with the Eastern Orthodox Church. And the three variables seem to be the different levels of verticality in the different faces of religion, the multitude of different kinds of work, but most important seems to be the spirituality of the individual, and that will transition and bring about different conclusions. For instance, in the old Soviet Union, there were concentration camps, and yet in that context, there was sometimes a huge explosion of spirituality, and it had something to do with the context, but because it was so oppressive, one had to go, oh God, help me, and lift me, and help me to transform this whole context, so that great saintliness emerged in that kind of a context. And that's harder to do at a Ford factory, on the assembly line, where it's such a routine and deadening often experience, so that there's a responsibility of the faith institution to transform its individuals. In all of the scriptures, we're challenged to be you transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you can prove those aspects of faith. And yet there are so many different levels of possible transformation, so that in our dialogues, we have to show how to be transformed. And there is a test of transformation.
Just a question: Are you
Am I
leading?
going too long? I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Are you
So my
leading up
question
to a
is,
question?
how do you get people to be transformed so that they can cruise through the different phases of work?
I'll take a stab at that. That's a big question. But I think one just general observation is that most religious leaders don't know how to answer that question.
Yes, that's right.
So there's a disconnect between the spirituality that's happening in workplaces and the understanding of religious leaders of how they might support that. So I think that what you say is exactly spot on. That all faiths are looking for the renewal of the person and the spirituality, and for many religious leaders, it takes place in the building as opposed to the workplace. So it is a challenge.
I do have a comment on the question, which is, it's whether or not the religious leaders are living up to the task or able to find the answers to these questions. It's not the business of government, or for that matter, of the workplace, to lift people up in that way. That is the role of their church or synagogue or mosque. It's the role of parents. It's individuals doing their own uplifting. But the government and the workplace has to stay out of that, except to some extent providing a forum in which people who want to be engaged in this are able to do so without interference. But it's explicitly not the business of the government to lift people up in that way.
So I'll tack on to that the McKinsey and Company, the large global consulting company, has a health institute, McKinsey Health Institute, and they've identified that there's 4 pillars of health: physical health, emotional health, social health, and then spiritual health. So on the question of whether it's Richard, on the question of whether it's a business's issue, to the extent that businesses take on the mission of ensuring that their employees are healthy and resilient, there is a place for companies to address the issue of spiritual health within the workplace. That is a bigger question. How, what's appropriate, what's not. And that I would even say even includes in a government workplace, that people need to have that spiritual health. That's a whole new topic and new research, but it's one that the research has shown that the older the people are generationally, the more they're spiritual healthily. And by spiritual health, McKinsey and Company defines it as having a higher purpose in life, having understanding what the meaning of life is. It's not necessarily, being a better Christian or being a better Muslim or those things, but that you're connecting what you're doing on a daily basis with something bigger than yourself. Is how.
Let me just suggest, though, beyond providing the space to do that, which I agree should be enabled, the problem is for the individual to find their particular path. That if that path is going to be within the framework of a particular religion, that's where you run into problems, because that's not something you want the government or the workplace to be suggesting. Well, why don't you try Catholicism, see if that works for you? That's just not appropriate.
Thank you very much. I'd certainly want to echo Fred's comments about appreciation for the three of you and for your presentations this morning. My name is James Christie, and I'm going to identify myself by one of my hats for the purpose of 2 questions that relate one to the other. One of my roles is as the ambassador at large for the Canadian Multi-Faith Federation, which has a great deal of concern for engaging the public sphere, particularly government in the public sphere, and private and religio-spiritual centers. So the first question is one that has arisen during the course of really just the last 6 months, arisen in a way that makes it visible. A brief context, the former police chief of the city of Winnipeg in the center of Canada, Devon Clunis, is a Jamaican by birth and a Black Canadian. And he has been engaging recently with leaders not only in the BIPOC communities, but particularly within the Indigenous community in Canada. And the experience of many of these leaders is that DEI or EDI, in some circumstances, has become weaponized. And by that, I mean that the original, well, our essential, I think, understanding of DEI is to create more inclusion, but through principles that might be loosely and popularly identified as woke, it actually is providing new ways of restriction and new barricades, blockades to the very inclusion which is meant to overcome. So the question associated with that is this at all evident a kind of misdirection of DEI within the sort of work that you're doing, amongst the three of you? And secondly, does business itself, or let's be very specific, the Religious Freedom and Business Initiative, if having noticed this, are there strategies to try and address that? That's the first question. The second question is in some measure like unto it. In the province of Quebec, which has always looked to France for much inspiration, the process of laïcisation has gone somewhat further than ever before. Any person who is employed in any aspect of the public service at all whatsoever is prohibited from wearing or displaying any form of religious apparel or any symbol of religion beyond perhaps the tiniest of crosses, as long as that's hidden. So I've noticed that most of the protest or concern or agitation is coming from the religious and call it social elements of society. Business hasn't said a word. Ought it to?
I'll do the DEI part. So on diversity, equity, inclusion, certainly the thing that they left out was religion. So in across the board globally, corporations focus first on race, second on women, gender, and then on sexual orientation and other things. And religion's the last thing to be added. So there's already been sort of a neglect of the religion topic. So the opportunity right now is, and companies are responding just to point that out, that religion is a protected characteristic, both in many places where the businesses work. And so companies are responding. On the sort of backlash against DEI, culturally, that's something very real. And I think many of the people that are responding to that are not they're not versed on the possibilities of that it opens for faith inclusion. And so I think that's part of the mission of my foundation, is the work that I'm doing is not only to promote this in business as best practice, but to help people who just outrightly view DEI as a woke political weapon against conservative values, that they may be missing something. So it's sort of a two-pronged issue that we're dealing with.
Eu queria também falar um pouco sobre isso. A questão da inclusão depende muito de que seja instalado nas empresas, um modelo de tolerância, porque há alguns modelos de interação entre o mundo corporativo e a religião. Há o modelo francês, que já foi falado aqui, que é um modelo de evitar que a religião se manifeste no ambiente de trabalho, certo? Então, na arena pública, a religião, a fé não deve se apresentar. O ambiente de trabalho é como um Estado laicista. Mas há também o modelo multicultural, do qual não vou falar agora, e há um modelo de tolerância, que é o que eu sempre proponho e sempre defendo. Esse modelo de tolerância, ele trabalha justamente com a ideia de inclusão, né, dessa diversidade, mas ele não exige que haja uma convergência de ideias religiosas ao ponto de alguém ter que abrir mão das suas convicções. Porque, infelizmente, tudo isso também passa por uma questão que a gente às vezes esquece de tratar, que é como as pessoas veem a tolerância hoje. E aí tem um teólogo canadense que eu gosto muito, que é o D.A. Carson, que ele tem um livro que ele fala da tolerância dos intolerantes, ou da, da intolerância dos tolerantes, que ele trata justamente isso. Sempre você divergir, você ter uma opinião diferente, seja a respeito de religião, de política, isso sempre foi natural. Isso não era impeditivo de que houvesse um respeito entre as pessoas que tinham opiniões diferentes, que expressavam opiniões diferentes. Entretanto, hoje parece que para você viver em paz ou ter tolerância com alguém, você tem que concordar com as ideias delas, né? Então, houve um caso, inclusive, nos Estados Unidos, que eu não me recordo agora que empresa foi, é uma corporação muito grande, que ela exigiu que os empregados assinassem o seu compromisso com a diversidade. E lá havia o compromisso de o trabalhador ele apreciar a diversidade, ou seja, ter uma valoração positiva acerca da diversidade. A questão era basicamente sobre a proteção das minorias em relação à orientação sexual, certo? E esse trabalhador, ele teve que ir à justiça porque ele foi discriminado, acredito até que ele perdeu o emprego porque não assinou a declaração da empresa. E ele disse assim como cristão, eu tenho que amar até os meus inimigos, porque Jesus disse isso, ame até os inimigos. Então eu amo todas as pessoas, independentemente de sua orientação sexual, e tratarei com respeito, e tratarei bem, e tratarei dignamente todos os meus colegas, independentemente de sua orientação sexual. Mas eu não devo ser obrigado a achar isso bom. Eu não devo ser obrigado a achar que esse comportamento é bacana, é legal, né? Então, eu acho que passa muito isso pela questão de que a sociedade está muito impregnada dessa ideia de que tolerância deve ser uma espécie de sincretismo, deve ser uma espécie de você tem que abrir mão de suas ideias, né? E se não fizer isso, você vai ser cancelado nas redes sociais. Eu não tenho rede social, graças a Deus. Pois não?
So the issue of DEI is enormously complex. I mean, on its face, who could object to diversity? Who could object to equity? Who could object to inclusion? And it's really a matter of definition. And just I'll state the conclusion first, which is I think an idea of promoting these things is not a bad idea. And in fact, but the issue is how do you implement it in a way that's as fair as possible to all concerned? For some, DEI is associated with a particular ideology that separates the world into the oppressed and to the oppressors, in which people are judged solely by which identity they have, and in which if you're not in one of the particular groups, you don't deserve the protections that go with DEI. And for instance, there are cases of human relations officials who are DEI officers who, when somebody Jewish comes to them with a complaint about discrimination or marginalization, they have said, that's not my wheelhouse because you're an oppressor group. Now the idea, and I said this at the plenary, the idea that Jews should wholesale be seen as some kind of oppressor group, given the history of our people, is astonishing. And yet there are people in the United States and elsewhere in the world who ideologically have come to believe that, and who think that vindication against anti-Semitism and against Jews being marginalized and ostracized, particularly there are cases where, somebody Jewish supports the very existence of the state of Israel, and that's somehow anathema that they should believe that they don't deserve the protections in the workplace. So the question is, what does DEI mean? How is it to be implemented in a fact that in a way that does take into account that there's a history of discrimination and marginalization of certain populations in the United States and other parts of the world, and we want to find ways to advance those groups so that they are advanced in the workplace in ways that they have not been in the past. That's a worthy objective. And how do you do that without marginalizing and harming other people at the same time is the challenge. Sometimes it's done well, and sometimes it's not done well. And So policymakers and I think ultimately the courts are working with some of these issues. Now you also asked about, if I understood the question, religious symbols on garb and other such things. I think that's part of inclusion. I mean, you know, again, we've, you know, some of the good work that Brian and others are doing are assuring that that DEI in the best sense includes religious groups of all kinds, and also an employee or anybody else should be entitled to wear markations reflecting what their faith is. Jews should be able to wear yarmulkes in the workplace if that's what they want to do. Muslim women wear hijab, Sikhs wear a turban, etc., etc. It sometimes is controversial. It shouldn't be controversial. And let me say that includes in the public workplace. There was a long time when people sought to have public school teachers not have any marking of what their faith is, and they were teaching because somehow it would look like the state was endorsing religion. I think we probably could count on fingers on one hand the number of pupils at schools who were ever confused as to whether or not the state was endorsing the religion of the teacher because the teacher had something indicating who they were. I don't think that describes reality, and it's really inimical to the idea we have to respect people for who they are.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, too.